Good day to you. Like many Americans, I was looking for something to do yesterday to socially distance in a safe way, and my wife and I decided to go kayaking on the Delaware River. As we went down that river, I couldn't help but wondering what life was like for indigenous peoples who settled that very river basin many decades and centuries ago. I thought about the Lenape Indians. I don't know much about them, but I know that they were fishers and that they used canoes all over the river, and they were basically a peaceful nation. I thought about those people as I went down the river and imagined how they would handle things like winds coming up, or strong currents, or rainstorms, or snow. As I went down the river, I didn't see any kind of markers symbolizing the culture of Lenape Indians, though. The closest I could find was when we arrived at our destination, which was the Shawnee Inn and Resort, taking the name of Shawnee Indians, and that's about it. You could see an icon that's at the Shawnee Inn that shows an indigenous person with feathers in their head. That's what it looks like to me. But there's no placards talking about the history of Lenape Indians. All you get when you get to the Shawnee Inn is some makeshift teepees that are slightly looking like tents, and that's about the heritage that's been preserved of indigenous peoples in this area. One of the main civilizations of indigenous peoples right here in northeastern Pennsylvania. So what happened? What happened to the Indians? Why are they not front and present in our culture like they are when you go to Mexico? You walk around Mexico and you see people who look like they could be living in the 1400s. They look like they've stepped out of a time capsule. They're dressed, they look very indigenous, if I can say that in a way that's not stereotypical or condescending. So that's what we're taking on today. We're taking on officially the chapter title, which is Cultures Within Cultures. But in my video lecture today, I'm going to focus really on two cultures in particular. We're going to focus on first the Amish, which I have direct experience with, and then Hispanic culture, which I promised I would spend more time on because of an earlier class where I short-shrifted Hispanic peoples. So that's what we're going to focus on. The book talks very early on about how there's these different ways that you can divide up culture into subcultures, co-cultures, and microcultures. We discussed that back in chapter 1. You know, after a while it just becomes like splitting hairs, as I say, where it's trying to categorize something that just makes it more confusing. So what we're really talking about here, in my view, is you have a nation state, which is the macro culture, the United States, for example, and then inside you have these smaller cultures. That's what we're talking about today, cultures within cultures. And the book mostly talks about those cultures as having originated from other countries, and then trying to understand whether those originating cultures that have come here have truly assimilated and become acculturated into the United States culture. So that's what we're going to focus on. The book starts out early talking about one group of people called the Hmong, spelled H-M-O-G. They came out of Laos and Vietnam. I'm not going to spend much time on them. I'll let you read about that material. It talks about how they came to the United States and some of the difficulties that they had in becoming acculturated into the United States. And then the chapter goes on to talk about Koreans in Russia. Again, that's something I'm going to leave you to read on your own. And then the chapter comes to the Amish. The Amish and the Mennonites, related religions, they both came out of Switzerland. And you have only to go just 2 hours away from where we are here in the Poconos to start experiencing the Amish. Even less of a distance if you go down to Kutztown. But most of the Amish are located in Lancaster County, where I went to my undergraduate college. And so the Amish, most people think of as people who are living in a past period of time and are not living in the future. They don't drive cars, they don't have electricity, etc. And that's true. But let's talk about the origin of the Amish, to study the Amish as a culture within a culture. So the Amish came out of Switzerland, like I said, and the population in the United States is one of the fastest growing populations. There are 300,000 Amish today, compared roughly with 40,000 Amish just a few decades ago. And they are spread throughout central Pennsylvania and Ohio for the most part. And, you know, I went to school at Millersville University, and we used to see the Amish buggies on the road on Sunday mornings. And we would think of them as a nuisance, right? Because we have to go around them as a vehicle, and they go very slow. And on 2-lane highways, it's sometimes tough to get past them. But there they are out there, pursuing their religious principles. It's a very religious culture. And let's talk now about the value dimensions that we discussed in an earlier chapter and apply them to the Amish. We can talk first of all about the worldview of the Amish. So they have this concept, Gelassenheit. I'm not a German speaker, so I may not be saying it right. Gelassenheit, which refers to submission. You submit yourself to the will of God. And then also they have this concept, this religious concept called Ordnung, O-R-D-N-U-N-G, which is the church rules and the values of community that are discussed and applied by local committee members for the community. And the values that are emphasized within these two ways of organizing their religious practices, Gelassenheit and Ordnung, the values that are emphasized are humility, obedience, simplicity, that's a big one, and sharing. So the Amish have been able to, because of the way that they immigrated into Pennsylvania, and what William Penn, the governor at that time, allowed, is he allowed the Amish to set themselves up as a much more autonomous indigenous community, indigenous from Switzerland, I should say, a much more autonomous community than many other cultures within cultures. So, for example, they have their own schooling system. They don't have to comply with federal standards of education. In fact, when you reach the 8th grade, you have your choice as an Amish person whether you want to go continue your education at home and work on the farm so that you can learn those life skills that will enable you to feed your family. And that's what most Amish do. They're farmers. They farm tobacco, they farm corn, they farm all kinds of vegetables, they farm livestock, and the family runs the farm. And so there's this way of perpetuating itself that the Amish are able to continue their ownership of farms because they don't have to hire labor. So their farm production is actually very, very productive. So that's why they don't need Social Security. They don't pay into Social Security. They don't accept Social Security. That's one thing they've been allowed to do by the government. Pride in the Amish value system is a sin. To take pride in something that you've done is a sin. And essentially what Amish people are trying to do, because of that simplicity value, is to shun technology. Now, technology, they will take a look at it. The community will decide whether technology can be introduced to the Amish community based on whether it helps the overall culture of the community. If it does not help the culture, they're not going to allow it. And sometimes they'll make modifications. For example, the bicycle was not allowed into Amish culture for forever until recently. But the Amish have decided that the kinds of bicycles that are going to be used in Amish culture have to be no-pedal bicycles. And that is so that the Amish person using a bicycle will not use it to go far away from the Amish community. That range of activity, that's what we're talking about now. We're moving into the activity orientation, the next value that I want to discuss. The range of their freedom is going to be close mileage-wise, literally, because you can't push a bicycle like a scooter. You can't push it very far away without getting tired. And that's a great example of Amish. If you go through the Amish countryside, you can always tell the Amish houses because they don't have power lines running out to those houses. And often the houses are built on a farm, and then a son or a daughter builds their house right next to the parents' house, and sometimes they even connect them through a little corridor. So we are talking about the activity orientation now, and in Amish culture, work is preferred over idleness. The idea behind work is that it brings the family together. And if you go out into Amish country in the middle of harvest season, or really any season except for winter, you see Amish people out there with ox. They're not using tractors, right? And they're pushing plows to the field. And you see everybody in the family is participating. The women are doing very different things. They're inside making pies and caring for the household inside, while the men and the males in the household are out plowing the fields. It's a very patriarchal society. And you can, as a non-Amish person, you can experience the benefits of their activity orientation. You can go to the Amish market in downtown Lancaster, and you get yourself a shoe fly pie, for example. It's a very Amish meal. Lots of jams that they sell there, lots of meats, produce. That's all coming from Amish farmland. And so the Amish culture is something that we have access to, and there's Amish handicrafts that are sold all over. One of the most important items that you can purchase if you're a Pennsylvanian is a shed. shed for your tractor, your lawn tractor, and your other gardening tools. And the Amish make sheds that are then imported to the rest of the state. Now let's look at the human nature orientation for the Amish. They use their own educational system, as I've said, and yet I've identified that they are very religious, but they have a strong separation of church and state. So religion is not taught in the schools. It's more important than to be taught in the schools, as the Amish view. It should be taught in the church. All right, now that we've summed up the Amish, let's move on to indigenous cultures. Indigenous cultures are people that have been looked at as primitive cultures, wrongly so, in my view, the cultures that did not advance as progress advanced. And you can find 5,000 indigenous cultures, 5,000, not 5,000 people, but 5,000 indigenous cultures across the world. And the policies that have been put into force in countries where these cultures are existing within the larger cultures, or the indigenous cultures existing within the nation-state culture, the policies that have been put in place have ranged from forced assimilation, forcing people to become part of a larger culture, like the Delaware River. You can't find any traces of Native Americans still living as they did, to force them into assimilation, or forced separation by putting them on reservations, for example. Canada had a very different path than the United States in terms of its indigenous peoples. It rejected extermination, which we did not. We had the Trail of Tears. If you don't know about that, I encourage you to Google it and look it up. And we have a lot of Indians on reservations, very, very poverty-stricken areas, reservations way out in the middle of the desert, the farthest reaches, with not much arable land. Canada rejected extermination, and instead it had a policy of trying to absorb indigenous peoples, Eskimos, you might be thinking of them as, by undermining their culture. By, for example, making jokes that Eskimos have so many words for snow. And that's making jokes about the Eskimo is outside and they're happy by cutting some blubber off of a whale, and that's their dessert. That's the way that I'm speaking a little bit out of turn here because I'm not Canadian, but Canada, in essence, rejected extermination, but still had a policy of discrimination. In Mexico, you have two groups of peoples you may have heard about. You've got the Mayans. They existed around the Caribbean. They were very forward-looking peoples, always trying to talk about the spirituality of the stars and what the future held. And they just disappeared. We don't know what happened to them, but you see people who look like Mayans still around Mexico. And then other people, the other group of people was the Aztecs, a much more warlike tribe. They built the pyramids outside of Mexico City in Teotihuacan. I've been there a couple times, and you see them all over Mexico. Montezuma and Montezuma's Revenge, if you've ever heard about that, where your stomach's upset the next day and you have diarrhea, that's the Aztec leader, Montezuma, who was imprisoned by the Spanish and put in a pyramid prison, and then they got him drunk, and he thought he was so happy that the Spanish gods had arrived to liberate his peoples, and it was just the opposite. They imprisoned him and killed him. Brazil also has indigenous peoples. They've decided to take 11% of their land and say this is going to be for indigenous peoples. Norway and Finland and Sweden has the Sami people. They live up in the Arctic Circle, where it's daylight almost all year round for half of the year, and then it's dark the other half of the year. So there's a lot of indigenous peoples around the United States, and the United Nations, in order to protect their heritage, developed the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is proposing, because the United Nations does not have any mandatory laws that it can force countries to abide by, it proposes that indigenous people should be able to govern themselves autonomously. That's why we have, quote, Indian reservations in the United States, where they exist unto themselves. In the U.S., there is the concept of assimilation that we refer to as the melting pot. And so we're moving away from indigenous peoples now. We're going to discuss, in general, the American concept of the melting pot. It's the idea that everybody comes here and loses their individual identity and becomes part of the greater stew, right? As you put your carrots and your celery and your onions in there, all becomes mixed together, and yet you can still determine the bits that are carrots and still determine the parts that are onions, but they borrowed flavors from each other. That's the melting pot concept. So to illustrate that, the book, the Fred Yant demonstrates that actually the largest ancestral group in the United States is German peoples. But that culture is not that evident in the U.S. I mean, you can look around, you can see some German cars. You can look around and you can see that there is sauerkraut sold in stores. There's little bits and pieces, but largely speaking, that German presence is not there in our culture. Instead, English has become the way that we have enabled the melting pot concept, as everybody starts to speak English. That's what we have expected in this country, and that starts to help to develop this melting pot idea. And the theory is that the first generation immigrants, some of you are in this position, you're speaking the native tongue, so to speak, in our country. So you're speaking the language of origin for your country. And then the second generation is bilingual. And then third generation, this is after people have arrived in the U.S. from another country, third generation is monolingual. And I have many Spanish language named students, I'm going to say it specifically that way for a reason, in my classes. And I often assume, oh, you speak Spanish, I'm going to try out my limited Spanish on you and see if I can learn anything and see if I can make myself understood. And a lot of times they're not speaking Spanish, and they're third generation. That language has gone away. Let's talk about integration in the U.S. now, different from assimilation. Integration is different from assimilation in that in assimilation, you're expecting the people who have come to the United States to lose their individual cultural identities for the greater cultural identity of being an American. But integration is where the culture is allowed to exist, not allowed, but finds a way to exist in the country, preserving some of the traditional values, but also adopting the larger values. So in the United States, we have integration, and one of the leading theorists that wrote about this was George Gerbner. He was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And Gerbner says that actually television is what has enabled us to do that. It's enabled us to homogenize, make the culture the same. We all dress similarly, baseball caps and t-shirts and sweatshirts. We eat similarly, hamburgers and hot dogs. We celebrate similar holidays. Family relationships are portrayed in television. This has helped with integration. One of the early television shows not talked about in the book that I'll mention here was I Love Lucy. I Love Lucy was a female comedian who was an American, Lucille Ball, and her husband was Desi Arnaz, a Cuban. It was actually the first interracial marriage ever portrayed on television in the 1950s. And it's a good example of how Ricky, as he was known, Ricky Ricardo, some of his comedic lines on the show were about how he would butcher butcher English terms, so to speak, when he would try to pronounce them. So there was a whole skit where he went through the bough of a tree. Why isn't that pronounced boo? Because other words that are spelled similarly to bough of a tree are pronounced boo. It's an example of integration. His Cuban identity was allowed to exist within the American culture, but he was clearly trying to learn English so that he could become an American not in terms of citizenship, but in terms of his identity. And the whole idea of English-speaking cultures is interesting, isn't it? Because in the United States, 20% of our population identifies as having ancestry from English-speaking countries. But we don't really refer to English speakers as a subculture within our culture, within our country, because it's the unifying culture. But at the same time, we will identify Spanish-speaking cultures as a culture that exists within our country, because Spanish does not perform the same function, the melting pot function, that English performs. So in Spanish-speaking cultures, that's what I'd like to move into now. 18% of the U.S. population, just 2% less than the ones who cite English as their ancestry, 18% cite Spanish-speaking countries as their ancestry in the United States. And yet only 12% of our population is speaking Spanish. And the Spanish have a very complicated way of looking at themselves. They're Spanish speakers or people from Spanish countries. There's a lot of hierarchy involved there. And the book goes into some terms that are used to try and demonstrate this hierarchy that exists within Spanish-speaking culture. You've got Spanish speakers. Those are people who can speak Spanish. You've got Spanish surnamed people. That's people who have a Spanish last name. You've got, you see so many people in the media who have English first names and Spanish last names today, like Alex Rodriguez, the first one that comes to my mind. Now, Alex is it's not a Latin term. It's a German term, but Rodriguez, yeah, there he is. So, him and Jennifer Lopez, another example, his wife or girlfriend. I'm not sure if they're married. Another good example. So, Spanish surname people. Next, you have Spanish origin people. That's people who came from a Spanish-speaking country. And then you have Hispanic people, and that's a controversial term because it's come to be known as people who have a connection back to Spain, not to Brazil, not to Mexico, not to Puerto Rico, to Spain, Hispanic people. And Hispanic peoples, they find that term sometimes to be offensive because it's like it delegitimizes you if you're from Cuba. And ironically enough, Fred Yant, after laying this out in this chapter, he goes on to discuss people later on in the chapter as Hispanic, saying for purposes of ease or convenience, I'm going to use the term Hispanic. Well, I can't bring myself to do that, and that's why I said earlier Spanish-speaking country people when I use that term to describe people. All right, continue on. You have Chicanos. Chicanos are Spanish-speaking individuals. Chicanos are people who have Mexican heritage who were born in the United States. You find a ton of them in Los Angeles. Then you have Latinos. Latinos are Spanish-speaking individuals who came from anywhere in Latin America. And then you have Mexican American. And those are people who are going through the assimilation process. They come from Mexico, and they're not Mexican, they're not American, they're Mexican American. They're going through their second generation, first generation assimilation process. And then you have Tejanos. Tejanos are born in Texas with Mexican ancestry. Within these cultures, you have Spanglish, which is a practice of code switching. It's going back and forth between two languages. You know, a great example is you can have a female saying, "Ir al supermarket." Ir is I'm going to the, al is the, ir al supermarket. And then you have the English word stuck in there. And even the average American uses gracias, no bueno, amigo, and hola. So Spanglish is real to all of us. Hispanic culture in the U.S., 17% of U.S. residents are of Spanish-speaking culture. There are more Puerto Rican heritage people in the United States than you have in Puerto Rico. And they are dispersed all over the United States, including Pennsylvania, but Spanish-speaking country people, there's my term again, are located in some central states. You got Florida, which has most of the Cuban population is concentrated, or ex-Cuban expatriate is located in Florida. But then you also have California, Texas, New York, Illinois, Arizona, and New Jersey is a big Spanish-speaking population in Reading, Pennsylvania. So the Spanish-speaking country population is dispersed everywhere. Now let's talk about their values. Again, applying these earlier terms, dimensions of culture to understand the values. Spanish-speaking country people are said to be very family and group-oriented. Now, I mentioned earlier that my wife and I have a place in Mexico that we saved up our money and took out an extra mortgage for back in 2007 to have as a place that we could go experience another culture in. It's in Mazatlan, Mexico. And there's a lot of people that rent houses down there, and when I talk to them, they say, you know, I'd love to rent to Mexicans, but I'm not going to. Because when you rent to a Mexican person, it means their whole family will be renting your place. So they may say, I want to rent your place for 2 people, 4 people, 6 people, but in actual fact, it's 18 people. Their relatives, their uncles, their aunts, their grandfathers, their many brothers are coming from all over the place. And that's the way that Mexico is, and Latin American cultures, very family-oriented. Children are absolutely cherished and celebrated. In fact, they're allowed to, quote, run wild, according to many Americans, because children are so celebrated within Spanish culture. And you often find grandmothers and grandfathers living with the family as well. I mean, the family is almost always included in everything. Nobody's ever excluded from Latino family culture if you're a typical Latino family. And within this family value, they have concept of a respeto, which means deferring to those who are valued as authority figures, respeto. And I feel that from my Hispanic students all the time. They come into my office, and by virtue of me being a department chair or professor, there's this kind of acquiescence that goes on in my office. This is a quiet respect that I receive from my Spanish-speaking students. Another concept that is endemic to Hispanic or Spanish-speaking country peoples is fatalismo, which is taking each day as it comes. You can certainly see that in Mexico, which has been through horrific history of being conquered by Spanish conquistadors and then ravaged by drug cartels. And those are the negative things about Mexico. It's a beautiful, fun place to go, and Mexican people are the kindest, warmest people I know, and really fun to talk to, and so unassuming. But there you have it. Part of that is because they have been, hit by so many bad events in their life that they just are prepared to take things as they come. And I think that speaks also to Spanish-speaking country peoples in general. Moving on to cultural identity in the media. Well, Spanish-speaking countries, and Spanish speakers have a very rich landscape of media to offer, even here in the United States. But even before we get to that, the libraries in Mexico are heavily patronized. People going to libraries and even paying subscriptions to read books. Educated peoples, I should say. Here in the United States, there are many, many newspapers, about 450 Hispanic newspapers in the U.S., or I shouldn't use that term, that's what Fred Runt used, I should just say Spanish language newspapers. Many magazines, such as Latina out of New York City, or People and Español, our very popular People magazine, Español, and really lots of our media are produced in a Spanish language version, including Vogue and Cosmopolitan. Radio-wise, radio is very important to Spanish speakers. For a start, Hispanic people, Latino people, Spanish-speaking country people, they love music. They're rarely without music. And the average Mexican can play a guitar. Like, it's not even rare for a person to play a guitar. Everybody plays an instrument or sings or is musical in some way in Mexico. When we go to Mexico, we have musicians coming up all the time when we're on the beach. Would you like us to play a song for you for $2? Yeah, there's so much music in Latin American heritage, and that's one of the reasons why radio is very important. The other reason is that radio is an oral medium, and there are more Spanish speakers than there are Spanish readers. So radio is very important, and you can find it all over, including down in Reading, Pennsylvania, and certainly along border states like California, New Mexico, and Arizona. Television-wise, some of the big markets in the United States are equally Spanish with television stations as they are English, like Miami and New York City and Los Angeles and San Antonio, Texas. The two big television networks, Telemundo and Univision, are pumping out programs every single day. The telenovela, which is the soap opera version of Spanish language speaking countries, is very important around the world. It's exported all over, telenovelas. When it comes to the internet, there's some research that suggests that Spanish speakers are more likely than non-Hispanic speakers or non-Spanish speakers to use the internet. I don't know if that still holds true. And now we're going to finish with Spanish language and marketing. Being that this is a capitalist country, Spanish peoples are often targeted with marketing campaigns. And sometimes products are exported using American marketing slogans to other countries with disastrous results. For example, the Chevy Nova in the 1960s was marketed as an automobile in Tijuana, Mexico. The only problem is Nova, when translated to Spanish, means no go. So that car didn't sell very well. Other examples include advertising low tar cigarettes. When translated to Spanish, it comes out as low asphalt cigarettes. Or beer commercials, like the slogan that Coors tried to translate into Spanish, "Get loose with Coors," came out with "Get the runs with Coors." You can imagine Coors didn't do very well with a slogan that translated that well. So this is going to wrap up our discussion of cultures within cultures. I hope you think about your position in your family and whether the things that we've talked about today are fitting any of your experiences. Have a great day.